Welcome to the London Business School webinar series, Beyond the Crisis. I'm Julian Birkinshaw. I'm a professor at London Business School. I'm your host for this entire series. I should also just briefly acknowledge that this is also an alumni reunion week for London Business School, so quite a lot of the audience are alumni. Special welcome to you. Today we are talking about a very topical issue, holding on to diverse talent through a major disruption. And to help us with this, we have two people. First of all, Professor Herminia Ibarra, who's a professor of organisational behaviour at the school and also the Charles Handy Professor. Welcome, Herminia. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Perfect. And also we have Melanie Richards, who's the Deputy Chair of KPMG, and she's been leading the inclusion agenda for many years at the firm and sits on the steering committee of the Hampton-Alexander Review, which is the UK government initiative that's resulted in substantial increases in the number of women in the boardroom in the UK. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Julian.
Perfect. Without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Herminia to get us started. Go for it.
Fantastic. Thank you, and welcome, everyone. What we want to talk about in this webinar is really explore how the huge changes that we're seeing to our working lives as a result of COVID-19 and its economic and social aftermath might affect the diversity landscape for years to come. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the early signals that we're seeing. There's some positive ones, things we're learning that we'll want to build on and keep going forward. And there's also some danger signals that suggest that if we don't act, we might be putting at risk some of the really hard-won diversity gains made over the last decade. So we'll talk about those, go into conversation with Melanie, and conclude with a few ideas about things that you can do to kind of seize the opportunity that we have here. I'm going to start with just a couple of fast words. Oh, actually, want to learn a bit about you. Tell us a little bit about who you are. So as we engage in conversation, we have a sense of where you're coming from. The first poll is just asking, what's your current work status? Employed, self-employed, unemployed, student. We have a wide array of people here. Which describes you? Okay. Okay, so few students, not a huge number. The larger share employed. Very good. Thank you for sharing that. And we've got one more poll to ask you about before we jump into our remarks. And that is, coronavirus has brought many changes to our work and study environments. In terms of inclusiveness, how has it felt for you? Has it felt more inclusive, less inclusive, or about the same? Very curious to hear your thoughts on this one. Right, so kind of a third. Interesting to pick up on that. But the highest number is about the same. Very, very interesting. All right, so moving on, I just want to say a few very general words about diversity. It matters. There's lots of research that shows it does with regard to lots of things that we care about in our organizations. Attracting and keeping talent, making good and innovative decisions, having a good orientation towards our customers, and employee satisfaction. It matters. We also know that gains have been fragile. Now, they will differ by type of diversity and group, but by and large, if you look at any organization like a pyramid, progress has been higher at the upper and lower levels, and it reduces as we go up higher. And that is within a broader definition of diversity. So we're speaking broadly, lots of dimensions, not just gender and ethnicity, but a range of things, including sexual identity and orientation, religion, disability, educational background, and of course, recognizing that there's an intersectionality in that different attributes might describe any person, and that will shape their experience differently. So just some broad orienting ideas. And what I want to jump into right away so that we can have time for discussion is, what are some of the early signals that we're seeing about the effects of COVID? And we're grouping these into three. It looks like we have different rates of layoffs for different groups. We have a differential impact of working from home for men and women, especially when young children are at home. And then what's more speculative, and there's conversation about what may be potential detrimental and as well as positive effects on inclusion. How might promotion to senior levels be impacted? And so I want to talk about each of these again, just lightly, so that we can jump into conversation with Melanie. In terms of layoffs, the data that we've seen comes from the US Department of Labor. And it does seem that men and women are differentially impacted, and that whites and minorities, Black, Hispanic, Asians are differentially impacted. There's a few different hypotheses about what that is, why that is. Women and minorities are overrepresented in high risk of layoff industries, for example, hospitality. But it also seems to be the case that part of it is because they tend to hold the lowest level positions and have the shortest tenures, and therefore are more at risk for losing their jobs at a disproportionately higher rate. In studies that have been done looking at how this has played out earlier, studies have shown that downsizing can significantly reduce managerial diversity when layoff rules depend on position or tenure, but much less so when they require an individualized evaluation. You're looking at performance, you're looking at criteria beyond just a single layer or just who have been the most recently hired people. In companies that rely on position or rely on tenure, you end up with drops that are significantly higher for women and ethnic minorities. And so something to pay attention to, which I shall return to. There's been a lot of discussion, there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of working from home. There's been a lot of conversation about the benefits of the flexibility that has brought, but there's also been a lot of concern about what might be the impact on men versus women, and particularly in families with young children at home. The hardest data that I have seen has to do with a particular sector, the academic sector, where journals in a number of disciplines have reported almost immediately an increase in submissions of papers by men, with men lead authors or sole authors, and a simultaneous decrease in submissions by women. And so that's an indicator that a lot of people have been talking about as something to pay attention to. The New York Times recently commissioned a study with Morning Consult looking at the distribution of domestic work and the distribution of childcare. And the conclusion, very broadly, I'll show you a couple of their charts, is that it isn't being divided more equitably than before, with 70% of women saying they're fully or mostly responsible for housework during lockdown, and 60% of women saying so for childcare. I'll just show you a couple of the graphs from the New York Times. This one is about housework, and if we look at all couples, women are saying they're responsible, 70% are saying they're mostly responsible for housework, such as cooking and cleaning. If you look at couples with children under 12, that number jumps up to 82%. So a concerning number. If you look at the numbers when you ask who's mostly responsible for childcare, it's 66% in all couples, and 70%, women are saying at 70% for couples with children under 12. So throwing some data out to suggest this is something we need to understand better and talk about. And then on the last of the items, trying to think about particularly what happens at the higher levels of the pyramid, at the more senior levels, and what happens with the perhaps high potential pools. There has just been discussion in different circles about to what extent would working from home reinforce some of the existing exclusive behavior that we've seen before. How is it going to impact involvement in decision making? Who's going to be in the know? Who's going to be in the inner circle? And some references have been made to previous downturns. For example, what happened in the wake of the financial crisis, when you start to see real restructuring, management shakeups, and who's going to win out, who's going to get promotions, who's going to be included in those inner circles, and is that going to be a diverse and inclusive situation, or perhaps not. And, you know, as well, we know that downturns, we talked about this a little bit when I did the last webinar on career change. Downturns spark reflection about life and career priorities, potentially spurring high-level voluntary departures, which can really, I mean, those are the role models for people lower down in the organization. So really giving some thought to flight risk and how to mitigate it. So 3 broad areas: who's losing their jobs, how are people being differentially impacted by working from home, and how does the whole situation affect who is included, who's promoted, who's likely to stay, who's likely to go. And with that, I will turn over for a discussion between Melanie and I. Melanie, you've been working on these topics for such a long time. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts from what you're seeing at KPMG, what you're seeing with your clients broadly in your activities. What's your take on all of this? What's promising and what do we need to worry about?
Well, thank you very much, Herminia, and thank you for that. And I'm delighted to be here. A huge question you've just posed, and I'll comment in a minute on the poll as well, because that was quite instructive. But when we think about where we are today, and we've framed this as, you know, the question of how do we ensure we retain diverse talent in our organizations, this isn't a new topic. You know, the question of how we retain talent has always been certainly on my agenda, on our agenda. But I think it's been thrown into sharper relief because of the sort of seismic change and massive social experiment that frankly is going on around the world. And I should start by saying that obviously I'm speaking personally from the experience of having largely office-based colleagues who've either been working out at clients or whatever else. And we have a workforce that has moved entirely to remote working. And that in of itself has presented challenges, but you know, having very quickly got over to the normality of all of this and the working virtually, I would make a couple of observations. The first thing is, and there have sort of been some pluses and minuses. I mean, we've been doing flexible working, as have many organizations for many years, but this whole experience is truly sort of democratized where we are, and everybody has been working flexibly. So it has given everybody an insight into the power of working flexibly and some of the benefits and opportunities that come from working flexibly. I would also say that certainly my experience has been, and talking to many of my colleagues, not all of my colleagues, but many of them, that it has felt more inclusive. You know, everybody's operating in a virtual environment. There isn't that question of who's in the office, who's out of the office, who's visible, who's not visible. So there have been some positive factors. I would say, however, it does matter how the technology is being used and how meetings are being run. But in some cases, people have felt more included depending on who the chair is. And I know that's true in a physical world, but I think it's even more true in in this remote world. Is, you can chair meetings and people feel much more included and being given an opportunity for their voice to be heard. And there's much more, in some respects, formality in making sure that happens. So all of those things, and there's been quite a lot written. Matthew Syed in the Times has written about the sort of democratization of the workplace and how positive a force for good that could be, and how much more acceptable that's made flexible working. That said, and you raised some of these points, so I won't don't all bear repetition in the presentation you just made. And it's not just in the US. These pressures of juggling, and particularly, here in the UK with schools still closed, for example, the whole question of how you juggle family life, caring responsibilities, and all of the things that have also come with the COVID crisis have created additional pressures. And there is no doubt that it feels like it is falling disproportionately on particular groups. Mm. The other thing I would say is that the COVID crisis itself has hit different groups in different ways, and we've seen, how that's happened. So that's kind of the landscape we're operating in. But where I think there's going to be a further challenge, because as we move back into kind of this mixed working environment where some people are in the office, some people are out of the office, and that's going to go on for quite some time, people's level of visibility in the office is going to be quite complicated. And we know, we know that it's absolutely true to say that, we all see progression through organizations and, how people are operating in organizations by part how visible they are, part whether they have good sponsorship and whether they have somebody looking out for them, looking out for their career. And all of this is making that a more complex question. And it was already a problem. Let's not gild the lily. It was already a challenge to ensure that a broad group of people inside an organization of difference were being sponsored. And I think this runs the risk of exacerbating that. And then the last point I'd make is, and I don't think, again, there's any secret, and I know we're talking to a very international audience, but I don't think it really matters which part of the world you're sitting in. We are heading into very deep economic headwinds. And you used a lot of statistics from the US in relation to layoffs, and clearly a lot of that has already been happening in the US, but in many countries, the furloughing of staff has been done. So it's somewhat delayed the question of what happens when redundancies or layoffs are made. And there's again, that you could see this as a threat or an opportunity. And the threat, of course, is how that is conducted. And I firmly believe that unless you are absolutely thoughtful and mindful about the inclusion and diversity question as you go through that process, and maybe we can unpack that a little bit more, then there is every risk that groups will be disproportionately affected. In some cases, not intentionally, the unintended consequences of how those things are conducted are at risk.
Can I ask a question there? Obviously, organizations could be anywhere along a spectrum of already being thoughtful and mindful about issues of diversity. Some have been doing it for longer than others, for example. Is that how it's going to fall out? So those who have already been quite sophisticated will be able to take that into account, others perhaps not as well? Or is there an opportunity to use this moment, I guess maybe to leapfrog if you haven't been in a leadership position, if you haven't had this as much top of mind, is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, and that's why I talked about, I think I was saying that I think it's a threat and an opportunity. Yeah. If I just come to the opportunity piece, I think that you're right to an extent. Where organizations have been doing a lot on this agenda, then I think, hopefully they will be more mindful already. But I still don't think that means that you can be complacent about this question, because for all that has been done, when you're working at the pace that some of the things and decisions that are have to be made are being made, it would be quite easy to, even in the best organizations, not be thoughtful enough. And so my simple observation is that I think there's no room for complacency. I think it has to be front and center in the conversation. Otherwise, we know what the results are going to be from the, well, we don't know, but we know that there'll be unintended consequences. What we do know as well, though, is that the other thing, just broadening this out a bit, is that, in the context of redundancies and what organizations are having to do, they are having to think about how they reshape their business models. They're having to think about, and alongside that, they're having to think about how they reshape their workforces. And of course, the big buzzword that's out there at the moment is the question of digitization, what impact that's going to have. And I think alongside the question of inclusion in its broader sense, the question of, as you reshape your workforce, how are you thinking imaginatively about how you continue to include people who not only may sit in underrepresented groups, but also don't necessarily have the natural skill base that you might imagine you need in that business of the future? How do you meld all those requirements and make thoughtful decisions about how you might both retrain and reshape your workforce at the same time as impacting greater inclusion and retention of people inside your workforce?
That's a huge, huge point, because the confluence of COVID plus digitization could really go in a lot of different directions. Let me ask a related question. I know you have been particularly interested in ensuring that opportunities be given to people from a broad array of economic backgrounds, particularly at the entry level in organizations coming out of universities and different programs. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think that there's a couple of questions, isn't there? The first question is, will organizations be in a position to continue recruiting new talent? And as they do so, particularly at the sort of entry level again, end student, apprentices, etc., how will they address that? And I suppose, one thing we know, and I can quote sort of statistics in the UK, unless people have had the experience of work from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they do not stand a chance of getting a job. And it's not so much about the work experience itself, it's about having contact with the workplace. And of course, this whole discombobulation is creating challenges to do that in the first place. And then further, when we're starting to think about recruitment, if we're not recruiting as many people, are we going to be able to think as broadly? And again, I think this is about thoughtful intervention and ensuring that when recruitment processes are being run, we are looking to target particular groups and continue to do that. And then the same applies with the sort of existing workforce. And this is always a kind of, difficult territory. But I think just making sure that we're looking at the composition of where we're starting and where we're going to.
Yeah, very, very good segue. I think your words, the words you have repeated, thoughtful, mindful, are really the ones to carry forward from this. And with that in mind, we have some ideas about 5 levers that you can be paying attention to as you strive to be thoughtful and mindful of the impact on diversity, on the choices that are being made today. So with that, let me go back to my screen and talk about five levers that we've been discussing with Melanie. 1 is managing layoffs with diversity in mind. 2 is a retention strategy. 3 is be mindful and thoughtful about key assignments. 4 is think about sponsorship relationships. And 5, throughout it all, don't think just about the numbers, but also think about inclusion. On the first one, with regard to managing layoffs with diversity in mind, the research shows clearly if you want to pay attention to the diversity profile and if you want to make sure it doesn't get lost, you need to think about what people can contribute, not just what jobs they hold, not just position and tenure, but think about performance, which is a more thoughtful process. And we've seen in the past organizations redeploy talent to areas that need strengthening. So for example, after the financial crisis, Southwest Airlines redeployed job recruiters, which they didn't need anymore because they weren't hiring, to frontline service jobs on the basis of some of the interpersonal skills that people had that made them be a good fit for those roles. So being thoughtful about layoffs is the first plank in all of this. A second one is to think about a retention strategy. And that requires being mindful of the fact that particularly at the senior and high potential levels, top talent who contribute difference can be high in demand. And the degree to which they feel that they are going to be part of the future moving forward, that they will continue to be challenged and to have key assignments, is going to affect whether they entertain alternatives or not. And particularly for those still kind of coming through the ranks, this point that Melanie made, and that I'll elaborate on a little bit further, having mentors and sponsors and people who are looking out for them is a big part of them feeling that there is a strong path forward. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit further, because what we're talking about here is not just are people present in the organization, but do they have opportunity? Are they being included? Are they being challenged? And so that leads directly to one of the key levers that has always been central to any diversity initiative is a diverse population having access to key assignments? You know, right now, there's a lot of mission critical things being done. There's a lot of task forces looking at how do we manage the fallout from all of these. These are high visibility assignments. And is a diverse array of people getting access to that? And we know from past research that the higher up we go in organizations, the less likely women and minorities are to be either in the P&L roles that lead to the top or other things that have strategic relevance at the time being mission critical jobs, key projects. So really important now, even more than ever, to be mindful of who's getting appointed to what kind of assignments. And related to that, what affects people getting access to assignments? Well, it has to do with who is mentoring them, who is sponsoring them. There's been quite a distinction made over recent years between mentoring and sponsoring. A mentor has knowledge and will share it with you. A sponsor has power and will use it for you. And we know from the different bits of research that underrepresented members particularly need sponsorship to get ahead, but they are less likely to get it. Sponsorship to navigate the political waters, to figure out the stepping stones, and to ensure that they're being considered for these key roles. And, you know, as Melanie said, this is something we've been working on for some time. It's a challenge. Companies know it's a lever, but it's been hard to formalize, because what you're talking about here is asking people to spend their own political capital, to invest it in people. And so one of the things that we've been developing here at LBS is a framework. Oops, what happened here? That went to one of my references, apologies. Is a framework for thinking about how to nurture real sponsorship behavior relationships, how to cultivate them, and how to have managers responsible for people thinking thoughtfully, mindfully about what roles they can play on a spectrum of relationships that might go from simply being a mentor who provides advice to maybe also strategizing about how to get ahead, to maybe opening doors, making introductions to other influential people that you know, to giving a high visibility opportunity, maybe to give a presentation or a project, all the way through to what we consider to be sponsorship, which is very publicly advocating this person needs that role, this person needs to be promoted. And so really paying attention to what are the behaviors and are they being applied to a diverse population. And finally, this is a broad one because it will be different in each and every organization, but you've got to make choices very much mindful of inclusion, which really has three dimensions. And that is, will people feel that there's an openness, that it's safe to express their ideas so that they will communicate them, so they will tell you if they think you're doing something that is not going to produce the results, for example. Is there a perception of equality? And that very much relates to the other levers we've talked about, equal chance for everyone to succeed. And is there a sense of belonging and positive connection to the organization? Just in concluding here, I think we both agree now more than ever being mindful of the diversity and inclusion implications of the choices and decisions that we're making during this crisis is hugely important. There is a danger when we're cost cutting, when we're in crisis, to let efforts that have been building that maybe haven't yet come to fruition, maybe yet haven't produced the results that we'd hoped for, to let them fall by the wayside. But that's a real risky strategy to take because that will affect our performance during the eventual recovery. And then there's a real learning agenda here. You know, we're experimenting with a lot of things, not just working from home. There's a lot to be learned. And how can we make sure we capture that learning and solidify the new inclusive practices that we're learning about as we create that new normal. So I'm going to conclude here. If you'd like copies of the slides, please write me. I'd be happy to send a synopsis. And with that, we can turn to a Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Herminia. Thank you, Melanie. So lots of questions as always, and some of them are specific to what you just discussed, and some are much broader. We'll start fairly specific. And Herminia, I guess one of your earlier slides was about obviously gender diversity. Someone was asking specifically about age discrimination. I mean, you won't have the data to hand, but do you get any sense, and obviously Melanie, you can comment on this anecdotally, but do you get any sense of if age discrimination has been an issue in the downturn, in the crisis?
I personally have not seen data yet, but I think we have to separate. There are areas where it will be easy to get data, like layoffs and the composition thereof. And there are going to be other areas where it's not going to be hard data. It'll be harder to see. It will be bundled with other things, but it's a good question to raise and think about. Melanie.
I think it's probably, if the question is, do we know yet? The answer is it's too early to tell.
It's too early to tell, but it's possible, and it's another dimension to be mindful of.
Well, indeed, and I think well, actually, certainly in the UK there are laws against age discrimination, and most of this will be because of unintended criteria that are being set as people think about how they reshape their workforces, and that's where the mindfulness comes in, to think about those things and the unintended consequences of what one's doing.
Understood. So there's a very specific question here about furloughing workers, and that's an expression that works in the UK. Not every country has a similar scheme, but the idea obviously of essentially paying workers to not work and then bringing them back more quickly. So the question is, what we've seen in some companies is the difference of treatment of furloughed versus non-furloughed employees, and the resentment felt when furloughed employees return to work. So again, this is anecdotal at this stage, but this is not a practice we've engaged in recent memory. Any thoughts about how we can manage bringing furloughed workers back, how the two sides relate?
Well, I mean, as you say, we're all learning on this, and I think that for me, I think being very transparent and open, probably in terms of why people were selected. I mean, these are just thoughts from me, because I think often where mythology starts to kind of build up inside businesses is when you don't talk about things. And if you know that that is sitting inside the organization, I think making sure that there is a bit more clarity maybe on why some people were chosen to be furloughed and others weren't, is a good place to start. And clearly, one of the most obvious places to start is usually because those roles weren't needed at a particular point in time when others were. But every single organization will have its own very specific circumstances as to why it chose to do what it did. And I think the more open one can be, the less mythology gets developed inside the business. So,
I mean, we're jumping around here, but several people ask about skills. What will be the new skills, if you like, for being successful in this post-COVID world, assuming that this work from home practice becomes much more prevalent? Any thoughts on that?
I can take a stab. Obviously, the concrete skills are going to differ by industry, by type of work. But I think what we're seeing now is that the capacity to take initiative, to adapt, to learn quickly new things is going to be much more at a premium as all organizations scramble for solutions and for streamlining. Learning to learn, being adaptive, collaborating with other people, collaborating online. I think the so-called soft skills are going to be increasingly at a premium.
I think the only thing I'd add to that, Julian, is when I talked about this great social experiment we're in the middle of, we've kind of condensed into sort of 3 to 5 years the advances we were likely to make in terms of the use of technology. Yeah. And so you have to say that, and the question of what do we mean by technology skills? Well, of course, at one end we mean data scientists, and we mean people who have spent maybe years and years studying in that kind of environment. But actually, I think Herminia's point is well made. I think people are going to need to be much more curious, and we are going to, in our organisations, have to engender more curiosity and willingness to try new things and skills. And I think often when we talk about technology, there is this assumption you need specialists, and certainly our experiences, and we're very focused on this, is thinking about, and Herminia raised it in her presentation, this question about what skills are portable and how those can be adapted. And I think when organisations are thinking about their reshaping, I think that's an important component. But I also think what we're going to see is much more responsibility on the individual for their own development and for their own curiosity and willingness to be open to change.
And this isn't a skill, but I have noticed that I've heard several people comment that introverts are having potentially a good crisis. In other words, some of the things that extroverts naturally kind of gravitate towards or benefit from are just not as available in a lockdown world. Any thoughts on that?
So I've had conversations with introverts who are actually loving this environment, and part of it is that particularly for office-based workers like ours, where there's a lot of kind of a regime of quite a lot of structure, because calls are being arranged and people are coming together and opportunities to collaborate, and their voices are getting heard. And I think the other thing is that often, and this is a gross generalization, and I'm not an introvert, so that for the introverts on the call, they probably may or may not agree, but I do think introverts, because they can be more thoughtful and reflective as individuals, I think that those skills will come to the fore, because where we're going through tremendous change, we need people with new ideas and a broader array of ideas. And that doesn't mean those exclusively sit with introverts. But I do think, having said that, I think it will be a matter of whether organizations harness those introverts in the right way. So there's a kind of a dual responsibility. I think introverts may be having good crises, but I also think it does depend on how the employer is using them.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly add two things. One thing I'm seeing across the board is people taking much more initiative for their own learning, going out and signing up for webinars, for things that are going to give them a particular skill that they need to be effective in this environment. With the introverts versus extroverts, I would worry a little bit, because the introvert stereotypically is going to focus on the task. And the extrovert is stereotypically going to focus on the relationships and talking up the ideas and the conversation before the meeting and that one after the meeting. I don't know exactly how that happens in the virtual space, but it does happen. It will happen. And, in the contest for ideas, it's never just the idea itself. So it's also worth thinking about from an inclusiveness standpoint.
Thanks. So this is a nice point, linking up working at home with networking. Did you evaluate, I guess this is to Herminia first, how the nature of the network within a company contributes or not to making working at home efficient? In other words, I guess a strong and reliable network might help to be more involved while we're working remotely. Do you want to comment on that, Herminia? I mean, it's more of I think it feels more like an observation than a question.
In cohesive networks, people don't hesitate to reach out to each other when they have questions.
Right.
And I think a lot of people feel like they're working with their group, with their units in an effective way, but feel a bit in the dark with regard to the broader organizational context. What are other people thinking about? What's the broader conversation? And, we spend a lot of time teaching our managers to have that broader, wider organization-wide view. And so what's happening to that as we kind of hunker down in our groups? And so to the extent that you have an organizational network that actually is cutting across the different silos, so that people will take that extra step of not just bumping into somebody for coffee, but setting up a one-on-one Zoom or a telephone conversation, the strength of the network is going to have an effect on that.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that, and Herminia, I'd be interested in your views, is that what we're finding is that there is more accessibility. Leaders can be more accessible in this environment because And so you're right. I completely agree with you. I mean, why wouldn't I agree? I mean, networks are fundamental to us all. But I do also think that something has changed slightly, the environment. And when I was talking about moving back to a mixed environment, that's really what I was alluding to, was the fact that as of now, everybody's operating in a similar way. We're having to schedule calls a bit more, et cetera, et cetera. Those kind of informal conversations, there are less of them. And that's because we're not sitting and working together physically in an office. So the network has remained important, but I actually think the bigger challenge is when we move back to this mixed working, it'll change the dynamic yet again.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've already heard from people that I know where there are some people going into the office because they have enough space to isolate and seclude themselves. And those people are having conversations that are shaping decisions, and the ones who are at home are not. And so there are real questions about whose voices are getting heard as these small groups kind of hunker down to work on critical issues.
Yeah, this hybrid world is going to be fascinating. I mean, those of us working in business schools and education, right, we're trying to imagine what hybrid teaching looks like. And, you know, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, to put it mildly, right? To what extent can you really have a group of people in the classroom as well as a group of people who are joining, you know, on Zoom, and give them even remotely the same experience? So.
Absolutely.
Okay, I've got another question. This was about this point that seniority and tenure being a driver for reduction in diversity. Someone says, surely what's going on here is it's going to be about the costs of laying off senior people, of course, who are disproportionately male, rather than a systematic bias that's actually going to be reducing diversity through layoffs. Is that a correct assessment? What's your view on that?
Well, the data that I shared was simply showing that oftentimes when layoffs are done, there are principles that get applied across the board. And in some cases, not others, the principle is going to be last in, first out, or there will be cuts of specific office or specific operations or specific countries. And so it's going to be different in every organization. And some it may be, you know, the very expensive senior managers. The only point is, be mindful, because diversity isn't equally distributed across an organization. And if you're not mindful, as you're kind of slashing costs, you could be undoing a lot of diversity gains that have taken a while to build up.
Cool. So it's a deliberately provocative question to Herminia. Herminia keeps mentioning McKinsey Quarterly and HBR. Where is the LBS thought leadership here? I mean, I know for a fact that there's an awful lot of LBS thought leadership. So this is an open opportunity for you to mention 2 or 3 of your colleagues who are doing really interesting research in this area.
Oh, of course, and there's so much. So one of my colleagues, Anita Rattan, has been doing a lot of research on the topic of inclusiveness and belonging. Her research, her scientific research, is on the issue of the sense of belonging. What is it that accounts for it? And as you might expect, one of the things that really drives sense of belonging is seeing people like yourself represented in key roles in organizations. But it has very widespread consequences for what issues you speak up and when you speak up, and your involvement in things that matter. And so so look out for that. And you know, this is not a plug for the Harvard Business Review, but many of us do publish in that, and you can find Anita's work very well represented there. My colleagues, Reina Brands and Isabel Fernandez Mateo, have been long studying networks, in particular looking at the gender effects of networks, which are different across contexts. In some cases, disadvantages, in other cases, advantages, but really kind of figuring out what are the things that we need to know as we strive to understand the powerful effects of the informal organization. My colleague Randall Peterson is an expert on diversity in groups. He's coming out with a new book on that, and he runs our leadership center and really very much a nuanced sense from research about how diversity affects the processes that then relate to the outcomes that we all care about, because it's a sophisticated or a nuanced relationship. It's not hike up diversity, get higher performance. There's lots going on, and his research really speaks to that. So that's 4.
Excellent. So very specific question. On the question of sponsorship, should the onus be on the organization to help employees get sponsorship, or do employees have to ask for it? What would you recommend to employees from underrepresented groups specifically? Melanie, do you want to go first on that?
I can see Herminia was desperate to go.
Okay, I know. I'm just trying to share the questions out.
Go ahead, and then I'll tag team. Go ahead.
Yeah, well done, Julian. So it's a very interesting question, and I don't think it can be left to underrepresented groups to simply just go and find their own sponsors, although I would absolutely encourage anybody, underrepresented group or otherwise, to think about this question of sponsorship quite deeply. And I thought Herminia's model was a really good way to think about it. I do know organisations that have, if you like, tried to force the sponsorship. And Herminia, I think you and I've talked about this, which this notion of we will give you a sponsor. But the personal capital that Herminia referenced is so important in the middle of this, because the nature of relationship means that you are binding yourself to that individual, and therefore your level of confidence in their work, your ability to rely upon them, are all factors. What I do think, and we touched on it in relation to what we broadly describe as kind of work allocation, I think you can put underrepresented groups and individuals into the line of sight of people who can have influence on careers. And truthfully, I think most of that is done by doing the job, by evidencing capability at the heart of this, and giving opportunity so that sponsorship can happen more naturally. But Herminia, maybe you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that you've said. And I think the key is organizations understand this is critical, mean well, but haven't learned to move into a kind of sponsorship 2.0 or whatever way you want to call it, because it doesn't work to mandate, and it doesn't work for people who don't have organizational power to put their hand up and say, please sponsor me. And so I believe what you have to do is put in place processes that help people identify each other and cultivate relationships that may not start out that way, but increase the likelihood that they will end up being sponsorship. And so that means making managers aware that this is a key role that they need to play, and that they should play it for some people, and make sure that they're mindful of the profile of the people that they're sponsoring, that they be held accountable for it, but they also be taught how to manage these dynamics and how to do it effectively in a way that's authentic to them, because you can't say to people, invest in someone you don't know or don't care about, spend your chits on that individual. You cannot, but you can start moving it in that direction.
Good. So we've got time for 2 more questions. I think one is mostly for Herminia, the other is mostly for Melanie. Herminia, can freelance temporary workers be helpful? In other words, we've seen this huge push towards people working freelance part-time. Is this enabling, shall we say, some of the trends or sort of pushes that you're working towards, or is it actually making it more difficult?
It's interesting. We're just having a conversation about that in an internal school meeting. Of course, with freelancers, you get the specific skills that you need at the specific time you need it, and you maintain flexibility. And so there's a huge role. For that. The worrisome part is for the freelancers themselves, when trimming needs to be done, oftentimes those are the first people to go. But certainly, that's one of the changes that will continue, that has been started over the last couple of decades, which is a much more flexible approach to your workforce, and really, thinking about your workforce very holistically in a way that also includes the freelancers. I also think that the freelance model is starting to be applied internally in organizations as a way of matching people to projects much more fluidly than it has been before. And that's something to take into account as organizations start to consider layoffs and restructuring. How can you make sure that you use the talent that you have more flexibly and more fluidly?
Got it. So final question, it's about the impact of all of this on society and the economy more generally. So Melanie, let me ask a slightly more targeted version, which is, you know, the role of policy in all this. I mean, you're involved, you know, in various ways in government-led initiatives. To what extent do we actually require government legislation to enable some of these things to be really done in a more systematic way?
And I, you know, from time to time I feel quite torn on this, but you know, when we talk about inclusion, we're not just talking about numbers, we're talking about people and we're talking about culture. And the challenge with kind of making big policy decisions and prescribing for this is that does culture, you know, does cultural change come with it, and how does that work? And if you look at something like the Hampton Alexander Review, which has had huge success in the boardrooms of the UK in getting more women in, and it's only one strand of the very many underrepresented groups we've been talking about today, a push to not impose quotas but get companies, the threat of a quota actually has had a better impact in making change over time that feels like it's more long lasting. And that isn't to detract from quotas, which we've seen across Europe, being imposed across Europe and have been successful. But what I would say is that in terms of building kind of long-lasting change, I think there needs to be a mix. And you know, that might sound weak, but I just think that you can't prescribe for everything if you're going to try and affect cultural change inside organisations and deal with some of these big societal issues. Herminia.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can only agree.
Okay. Well, we are out of time. So if we could, Lawrence, if we could just get that final slide, just to give everybody a little of a sense of what the next webinar in our series will be. It is on Tuesday next week. It's by our colleague Linda Grattan, who's a professor of management practice here at the school, with Jenny Emery, who's the global people and culture leader at Arup, the engineering construction consultancy firm. And the topic is how to build collaboration innovation in the coming months, obviously with the lockdown in mind. So we are going to finish there. Please feel free to sign up at the URL you see there. If you want to get a copy of today's video, please go to that same URL. It just leaves me to thank Herminia and to thank Melanie for a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much both. And it was a great pleasure to have you. And thank you again, of course, to the audience for listening. So I will see you all again on Tuesday next week. Thanks very much.